before we begin recounting the events of the following war. If you're someone who enjoys history and the stories of soldiers and battles that changed the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the events we cover here. And share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever served in the military, or do you wish you could experience what it's like to serve? Your opinions mean a lot to us and help us build a true community of history enthusiasts. January 26, 1945. A thin, brittle light crept over the frozen fields around Holtzwihr, France, and the air smelled of diesel and burnt metal. Lieutenant Audie Murphy's company, ragged, half-spent from weeks of push and counterpush, held a scar of a defensive line near the village. Men were cold to the marrow, ammunition low, radio sputtering. They had already given more than they had to give. The German counterattack arrived like a machine set loose. Armor and infantry strafing down sunken lanes, flamethrowers licking at hedgerows, panzer crews pressing the pocket hard. Communications frayed, neighboring units melted back under pressure. Orders trickled down through exhausted voices. Withdraw where possible, regroup. Retreat was not disgrace, it was survival. Murphy heard the orders and passed them along, watching his men tighten their grips on weapons that had grown heavier by the minute. Then the German tanks found them. A tank shot tore through a nearby vehicle. Smoke and sound swallowed the morning. One of the American tank destroyers caught fire and went silent, its crew gone or scattered. Between the smoke and the scream of engines, the enemy closed to a handful of 100 yards, close enough to see faces through slits, to watch a machine gun crew reload. The line wavered. Men began slipping away under the cover of trees and drifted like exhausted shadows toward the rear. Something in Murphy's jaw set. He saw, with the thinning clarity that fear sometimes gives a man, what would happen if the Germans punched through this point. A straight road into the division's rear, men trapped and cut off, weeks of advance undone in hours. Retreating meant leaving the flank exposed. Staying meant almost certain death. He chose a third thing. Instead of falling back, Murphy moved to the burning tank destroyer. The vehicle's .50 caliber machine gun, blackened and still warm, could sweep the lane. There was no glamour in the motion. A young officer hauling himself atop hot steel, stripped of all pretense, intent on holding a wedge in the line by sheer, stubborn fire. He clipped in, braced his shoulders against the recoil, and began to fire. Around him, men hesitated, then found their footing. The mechanical staccato of the machine gun cut into the German advance like a blade, and for the first time that morning, the attacker stalled. Murphy's voice came through a battered radio as he called for artillery on coordinates he could barely see. He directed fire with the economy of a man who knows every second counts, adjusting corrections until the enemy's formations thinned and broke. The Germans pressed harder, smelling blood. Their infantry tried to close in behind the tanks. Flamethrowers probed hedgerows for hiding men. Murphy's .50 cal spat until his hands ached and the barrel grew white-hot. When the gun snagged and the feed jammed, he ripped at the ammunition belt with numb fingers and kept firing. Improvisation was its own kind of courage. Shells began to fall around him, chiseling the earth into pockmarks. A mortar round kicked dirt into his face. Shrapnel nicked his leg. Medics waved him back, then stopped. He would not move. Instead, he stripped off his helmet, used the leather as a pad to keep the gun steady, and barked coordinates into a radio with the calm of a man who had run out of options but not of solutions. "Fire mission on my position," he said, and repeated the grid until the artillery understood. He called for the rounds to fall dangerously close, so close the ground around him stuttered and jumped. The bursts landed like a handmade wall between his men and the enemy, deadening the German momentum and forcing tanks to pull short or risk friendly fire. Infantry crawled forward, only to be met by a rain of lead. Murphy abandoned the machine gun when the ammunition was exhausted, and with deliberate brutality, picked up a rifle and a handful of grenades. He moved along the line from foxhole to foxhole, shouting terse orders, redistributing grenades, dragging struggling men into better cover, and firing with the economy of a man who knew precisely where each round would land. At one point, a German tank crept to within a few dozen yards and trained its main gun on the burning vehicle where he'd been fighting. The tank's commander peered through a slit, thinking the Americans beaten. Murphy aimed a rifle at the silhouette, squeezed, and the round smashed through a vision port, a hit that unnerved the crew and bought precious seconds for his men to reorient. By afternoon, the ridge was a study in controlled chaos. Smoke, clotted snow, men clinging to breath and weapon. Murphy's voice was constant, short commands, encouragement where he could spare it, curses when he could not. Wounded soldiers were hauled to hollows he'd pointed out. A young private who'd frozen in fear found a rifle in his hands and a shove from Murphy's shoulder that sent him back into the fight. His uniform darkened with blood and oil. His face narrowed into a map of exhaustion. Still, he refused to be relieved, refusing stretchers and offers to pull him back. The German attack, which had bent the line into a brutal arc of retreat, had begun to falter. Murphy's stubborn presence, a single man choosing not to yield, had become the hinge on which the day turned. Night was coming. Reinforcements were still hours away. Murphy tightened his fingers around a rifle, listened to the field breathe, and prepared to hold the ridge until help could break through or until nothing remained to hold. The afternoon bled into a harsh, blown-out gray, and the Germans pressed every advantage. Murphy's right arm throbbed where a splinter of shrapnel had nicked him. The cold had found every broken place in his clothes. Still, he moved like a man with no permission to feel pain, checking weapons, passing a clipped magazine, barking a single blunt order that put a terrified private into the fight and a wounded corporal into shelter. When the .50 caliber on the burning tank seized from heat and metal warping, Murphy did not hesitate. He tore open the feed, jammed belts by hand, and kept the gun cutting the lane in wedges of stinging lead. When infantry tried to edge forward behind that suppression, he flipped to a rifle, then to grenades, then to the pistol he kept tucked where a man keeps a last thought. Each exchange of fire was economical, aimed to break the rhythm of the attackers, not to punish vanity. At one point, a German counterassault crept close enough that Murphy could hear the rasp of boots through snow and the metallic whisper of bayonets. He crept along the ruined vehicle line, dropped a grenade into a foxhole, and exchanged rapid fire at point-blank range. Men who had been paralyzed by fear watched him move and found the courage to breathe, then to shoot. The line steadied not because the odds shifted, but because one man's relentlessness rewired the unit's will. Radio static hissed like a threat. Murphy keyed the transmitter as shells bloomed nearby and spoke crisply to the artillery battery. Coordinates, bearing, urgent correction. He did something no officer dreams of without a cold stomach. He requested fire dangerously close, close enough that the screams of falling rounds could have been mistaken for friendly betrayal. The crew understood. The barrages dropped in precise curtains that ripped into German formations and bought the defenders impossible windows to regroup. Wounded men were pulled to hollows he'd pointed out. Ammunition was redistributed with a surgeon's efficiency. When a German armored car probed the edge of their position, Murphy sighted a rifle at the vision slit of a crewman and fired. The single, small hit unnerved the vehicle and forced it to withdraw. He kept tally not with numbers but with moments. Time held, breath saved, a flank unchanged. By dusk his voice had the brittle edge of a man running out of reserve strength. His face was smeared with oil and blood. His hands trembled but did not betray him. As darkness closed, Murphy moved among the men once more, a quick word for a boy who could not speak, a hand on a shoulder for a man who would not meet his eyes, then took up position again on the ruined turret, waiting, watching, refusing to let the line break on his watch. When the first hint of a counterattack formed on the German side, many soldiers on both sides mistook Murphy's single, steady presence for a larger force. That misperception held long enough. Reinforcements had not arrived, but the ridge did not crack. The night settled. The company lived to fight another hour because the lieutenant above the smoking steel would not allow it to fall. The explosion hit before Carter even reached the truck. A deafening blast tore through the courtyard, throwing him onto the cold dirt. Shards of metal rained down like burning hail. For a moment the world spun, smoke, dust, silence. Then the screams began. Carter forced himself up, ears ringing hard enough to drown out his heartbeat. The supply truck was gone, just twisted steel and a crater glowing with embers. The rebel fighters had detonated it remotely, which meant they knew. Someone had warned them. A traitor was inside the base. He moved fast, ducking behind rubble, scanning shadows as gunfire erupted from the perimeter. But something wasn't right. The rebels weren't attacking, they were searching, hunting. For him, Carter sprinted toward the command outpost, lungs burning. He needed to reach the encrypted radio before the traitor did. If the rebels retrieved the codes inside, they could intercept every movement of his unit. As he rounded the corner, he saw the radio hut door open, hanging crooked, its lock blown clean off. Someone had beaten him there. Inside, the lights flickered. A soldier lay on the floor, unconscious, pulse weak but alive. Carter's blood turned cold. He wasn't alone. A silhouette moved behind the shelves, quick, sharp, deliberate. Carter ducked just as a knife slashed through the air. He kicked forward, driving the attacker back, both of them crashing into the metal cabinets. The hooded figure lunged again, silent and precise. This wasn't a rebel. This was someone trained. Carter grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting until the knife clattered away. The hood fell back. And he froze. It was Sergeant Hale. His radio operator. His friend. Hale's eyes were cold, empty, like a man already dead inside. "You should have stayed at the barracks, Carter," he hissed. "They were only supposed to take the codes. You weren't meant to be here." Carter didn't understand, not yet. But he knew one thing. Hale wasn't leaving that hut with the codes. He tightened his grip on Hale's uniform, voice low and steady. "Then you picked the wrong night to betray the wrong man." Outside, the gunfire intensified. The base was collapsing into chaos. Inside, only 2 soldiers remained standing. One loyal, one traitor. Only one would walk out alive. Hale struck first, fast, vicious, and far stronger than Carter expected. The impact slammed Carter against the wall, knocking the air from his lungs. Hale grabbed the encrypted radio pack and bolted for the door, but Carter launched himself forward, tackling him to the ground. The 2 men rolled across the floor, fists cracking against bone, boots scraping against metal. No words now, only survival. Hale managed to break free and staggered to the doorway. Outside, rebel fighters were closing in through the smoke, their silhouettes multiplying with every second. Hale raised a signal flare, bright red, the mark that the codes had been secured. If it fired, the rebels would storm the base. Carter reacted on instinct. He snatched the fallen sidearm from the ground. His vision blurred from the smoke and blood dripping into his eye. His hand shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The flare hissed, ignition starting. Carter exhaled once and fired a single bullet. The flare burst in Hale's hand before it could launch, engulfing him in a blinding flash. Hale collapsed instantly, the radio pack tumbling beside him, untouched by the flames. The rebels saw the red flare cloud and misunderstood it. They thought it was a misfire, a failure. They retreated. The attack collapsed in seconds. Carter dragged himself out of the hut, coughing, half blind. Reinforcements finally poured into the courtyard, securing the perimeter. The smoking ruins around him felt impossibly quiet after the chaos. He was alive. He had stopped a traitor. And he had saved the entire battalion's intelligence network with a single shot. Hours later, as dawn bled across the shattered base, the commander approached him. "Carter," he said, voice low but steady, That wasn't luck. That was brilliance under fire. Carter didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, the heat of the sunrise warming the bruises on his skin. He didn't feel like a hero, only a soldier who had done what needed to be done. And in the silent light of morning, one truth settled on him. Sometimes the genius of war isn't in strategy or planning, but in the one impossible decision a soldier makes when no one else can.